Greetings, and welcome to a story that defies everything you thought you knew about aerial combat in World War II. At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands in August of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched helplessly as his wingman's P-38 Lightning spun uncontrollably into the Pacific Ocean, caught in a deadly ambush by Japanese Zero fighters. Moments later, he found himself alone, with a Zero bearing down on him, lined up for the kill. In a move that challenged every rule of pilot training, Bong inverted his aircraft and yanked the control stick forward, plunging himself toward the sea, upside down, in a desperate bid for survival. How could such a reckless maneuver turn the tide of dogfights across the Pacific? Could flying inverted really be the key to outsmarting an enemy aircraft designed for agility? And what other secrets did these pilots uncover in the chaos of combat, secrets that forever changed aerial warfare? In those critical seconds, Bong's daring move not only saved his life but revealed a tactic so radical it violated every principle taught in flight schools, yet it worked. Pilots learned that enduring brief moments of blood rushing to the head, risking structural stress, and flying inverted could outmaneuver the most agile fighters. But how did they justify risking blackouts for a chance to escape death? And what did these inverted dives say about the limits of the human body under extreme stress? As we unravel this story, we'll explore how a small cadre of American pilots discovered that sometimes the boldest, most unpredictable moves, turning upside down and diving into danger, were their best hope against a ruthless enemy. Because in the brutal skies over the Pacific, survival depended on daring to break every rule, on improvisation born from necessity, and on understanding that in aerial combat, sometimes the greatest strength was to fly, literally, against convention. And now, the real fight begins. At an altitude of 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands in August of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched a perilous scene unfold through his cockpit canopy. His wingman's P-38 Lightning spun uncontrollably downward into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Just moments earlier, they had been engaged in combat with 3 Japanese Zero fighters that had successfully ambushed them from above, catching them off guard. Now, Bong found himself alone, with a single Zero rapidly closing the gap and lining up on his tail. He instinctively executed what was considered a textbook defensive maneuver, banking sharply to the right with full throttle, trying to outclimb the pressing threat. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, the Japanese pilot demonstrated remarkable agility, executing a tighter turn that left Bong's aircraft vulnerable. Within seconds, the Zero fighter had positioned itself perfectly, sliding into a firing solution. Bong realized he had perhaps 4 seconds at most before his aircraft would be devastated by 20mm cannons, ripping through the metal with devastating force. What transpired in those critical moments defied every standard procedure learned during pilot training. Instead of following the expected escape pattern, Bong inverted his P-38 completely and yanked the control stick forward sharply. In doing so, his plane plunged downward toward the ocean rather than climbing away from the Zero. Because his plane was upside down during this maneuver, it turned in a direction that the pursuing Japanese pilot did not anticipate, a move that would come to be legend. As blood pounded in his head from the inverted position, Bong's vision blurred at the edges, turning red in a sensation that seemed almost insurmountable. For a harrowing 2 seconds, he could barely make out his instrument panel, struggling to remain conscious long enough to make sense of his situation. Then, he rolled the aircraft back to a level position. At about 12,000 feet. In the aftermath of this daring move, the Zero was no longer directly behind him. Instead, it was above and overshooting, completely out of proper firing position. Incredibly, Bong had survived. But more than that, in those critical moments, he had stumbled upon a tactic that would forever alter aerial combat tactics across the vast Pacific theater. This seemingly reckless maneuver violated every principle taught at flight schools across the United States. Instructors in training bases located in California and Arizona had issued stern warnings against negative G flight, courses of action that could lead to engine failure, structural damage, or even unconsciousness in the pilot due to blood rushing away from the brain. Yet, in the brutal reality of combat, those warnings often paled in importance compared to the imperative of immediate self-preservation. Japanese pilots had mastered their own form of tactical ingenuity after years of relentless combat over China, where they refined tactics tailored to exploit their aircraft's strengths. Most notably, the agility and performance of the Mitsubishi A6M0. American pilots soon learned that sticking rigidly to peacetime training made them vulnerable and that improvisation often meant the difference between life and death. The story of inverted flight tactics encapsulates something far beyond standard military orthodoxy. It speaks to the extreme pressures and grave realities faced by pilots fighting a relentless and adaptable enemy. Between 1942 and 1944, a small but remarkably brave cadre of American fighter pilots discovered that the human body could endure physiological stresses once considered impossible by aviation medicine. They learned that their aircraft could withstand maneuvers many engineers warned would cause structural failure, and that sometimes, survival depended on charging straight toward the threat rather than fleeing from it. This was not the sanitized, glossy version of aerial combat often depicted in official after-action reports or history books. Instead, it was raw, visceral innovation born out of necessity. Split-second decisions, choices made amid chaos, separated those pilots who returned safely from those who would become names etched into the casualty lists. The innovative tactics the Americans developed during this period sprang from a brutal reality. Survival was as much about daring and unpredictability as it was about skill. The Mitsubishi Zero, which entered fighting over China in the year 1940, had quickly built a reputation for its unmatched agility and range, thanks to its lightweight design and advanced aerodynamics. By the time the United States officially entered the war in December of that same year, Japanese pilots had compiled thousands of combat hours, perfecting their strategies and gaining invaluable experience. The Zero's superior performance was no accident. It was the result of years of tactical refinement and the ruthless discipline of Japanese military aviation. In the cold, vast silence of the Pacific skies, what the Zero fighters possessed in speed and maneuverability was matched by a fierce, brutal understanding of the necessity of innovation, an understanding that explosive maneuvers like inverted flight could mean the difference between life and death, a lesson brutal enough to reshape the way aerial combat was approached. This was not just a chapter about a daring pilot's stunt. This was about the relentless evolution of tactics in the face of mortal danger, driven by the clear-cut imperative that sometimes, the only way to the maneuvering characteristics of the Zero fighter aircraft posed a deadly challenge for Allied pilots during combat. Unlike many of its contemporaries, the Zero was exceptional in its ability to outmaneuver opponents at speeds below approximately 300 miles per hour. At these lower velocities, it could execute turns so tight that few fighters could match its agility. Specifically, its turning radius during combat was roughly 400 feet narrower than that of the P-48 Lightning, a premium American fighter, and nearly 500 feet tighter than the F-4F Wildcat, which was a robust ship but less nimble in tight turns. In a typical aerial dogfight, especially the kind emphasized in traditional American training, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his adversary's turn, maintaining an advantage and securing a clear firing solution within moments. Early combat reports from the Philippines and Java painted a somber picture of these encounters. American pilots adopted boom and zoom tactics, where they would dive from high altitude, unload their missiles or bullets on the Japanese fighters, then attempt to climb away before the enemy could react. However, if the initial attack failed to destroy the Zero, it could deftly adopt a tight horizontal turn with remarkable efficiency. When an American pilot tried to follow, he would find himself on the outside of the turn, his energy dynamically drained, turning him into a vulnerable target rather than the predator he intended to be. By mid-2042, the statistics revealed that the success rate in aerial combat was heavily skewed. In some sectors, Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios of 3-to-1 against their American counterparts. Many squadron commanders recognized, and admitted in official reports, that they simply could not contend in turning dogfights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, operated by both Navy and Marine pilots, had advantages such as higher diving speeds and greater resilience under fire, thanks to its armor features. Yet, its rate of roll, a critical factor in quick maneuvering, was relatively sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk also demonstrated solid vertical climbing and diving capabilities, which proved useful in certain combat situations. Conversely, it suffered somewhat at higher altitudes, which often coincided with the timing and places of battles in the Pacific theater. The P-38 Lightning, distinguished by its twin-engine layout and heavy armament, was a fast and heavily armed aircraft but suffered from a broad turning radius. This made it more vulnerable in the horizontal dogfights where agility was crucial. Each American fighter had its own strengths, whether it was firepower, armor, dive speed, or resilience. Nonetheless, none could match the extraordinary maneuverability of the Zero when it came to conventional turning combat. American pilots were advised to leverage their aircraft's advantages, such as speed, armor, and energy, avoiding close, turning dogfights whenever feasible. The goal was to preserve their energy and adopt offensive tactics that played to their aircraft's strengths. This advice was logical, but combat rarely unfolded as expected. The real complicating factor was the exceptional skill and tactical mastery of Japanese naval aviators in the years of 1942 and early 1943. Many of these Japanese pilots had extensive combat experience dating back to the late 1930s. They had mastered complex techniques such as energy management, balancing speed and altitude, precision deflection shooting, and disciplined formation tactics. Their expertise allowed them to manipulate American pilots into unfavorable situations where the Zero's remarkable agility became the critical factor. A common Japanese strategy involved using one Zero as a bait. It would fly straight and level, presenting what appeared to be a vulnerable target. When an American pilot committed to an attack, two more Zeros would swoop in from above or flank them from the sides. Suddenly, the American fighter found itself in a defensive posture, which typically meant engaging in a turning fight. This was precisely where the Zero's superior maneuverability and agility gave it a decisive advantage. The fundamental mathematics underlying turning combat are unforgiving. The turn radius of an aircraft depends directly on its velocity and the g-forces it can sustain during a turn. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved in part by sacrificing armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, conferred a significant advantage. Its lower weight meant it could sustain tighter turns at higher g-forces with less loss of speed. In contrast, American fighters, built sturdier for durability, were equipped with armor plates behind the pilot, and self-sealing fuel tanks designed to prevent fires, features that increased weight and reduced agility. This extra weight allowed pilots to survive hits but came at the cost of slower, less responsive maneuvering. In essence, the Zero's superior maneuverability was rooted in its design philosophy, an aircraft optimized for agility, capable of executing rapid, tight turns thanks to its lightweight framework. The American fighters, though more heavily armored and better equipped for durability, could not close the gap in terms of agility, especially when facing well-trained and tactically proficient Japanese pilots at their peak. This disparity in agility and tactic mastery contributed heavily to the early dominance of Japanese air combat performance during the swiftly evolving air battles over the Pacific during World War II. American pilots found themselves at a significant disadvantage in terms of aircraft design. The planes they flew, fighter aircraft intended primarily to maximize survivability rather than agility, had been heavily modified with additional armor plating and increased wing loading. These modifications, while improving their chances of survival when struck, also made the aircraft less nimble. Consequently, American pilots faced an enemy that possessed a substantial edge in aerial combat tactics, simply because their adversaries' planes were more maneuverable and agile when compared to the more robust but slower fighters assigned to the Allied forces. Throughout this tense contest, one of the most critical challenges for these American pilots was the formidable skill of their opponents, as well as the limitations imposed by their machines. Traditional aeronautical wisdom and tactical doctrines appeared insufficient in bridging this gap. It was evident that a breakthrough in dogfighting tactics was needed, an innovation born not from formal military manuals or textbooks on aeronautics but from sheer necessity and a stroke of accident. The maneuver that would, over time, prove to be a life-saving technique for countless American airmen was later dubbed the Split S. This maneuver was simple in concept but requiring precise execution. It involved rolling the aircraft upside down and pulling back on the stick to go into a steep diving turn. Interestingly, this move challenged conventional wisdom about aircraft stress and the human body's limits. Its development and adoption were more a product of battlefield improvisation and experimentation than deliberate tactical planning. To understand its significance, it's important to consider how pilots experience G-forces during flight. Under normal flying conditions, pilots endure positive G-forces, forces that push blood away from the brain toward the lower extremities. When pulling tight turns, pilots can experience several Gs, typically around 5 or 6, leading to symptoms like gray outs or even full blackouts as the brain temporarily receives less oxygenated blood. These effects pose deadly risks during combat, when maintaining conscious awareness is crucial. In contrast, when a pilot flips the aircraft upside down and pulls the control stick forward, essentially pulling the aircraft into a dive while inverted, they experience negative G-forces. These forces cause blood to rush towards the head, creating a phenomenon known as red out. In this state, the pilot's vision takes on a reddish hue as blood vessels in the eyes become engorged. According to aviation medicine studies from as early as 1942, humans could scarcely tolerate sustained negative Gs. Anything past -1 or 2 gigaseconds led to discomfort, disorientation, and potential damage to the retinas. Officially, the guidance was to avoid negative Gs entirely, as they posed serious health risks. However, combat flights presented a different calculus altogether. Soldiers on the front lines faced life and death decisions, where survival depended on split-second actions. For a fighter pilot, experiencing just a brief red out, perhaps for a couple of seconds, could mean the difference between escape and surrender. A pilot who managed to endure a moment of red out and flying away from an attacking Zero could live to fight another day. Conversely, one who maintained perfect positive G flight but remained within the crosshairs of a Zero's guns was at inevitable risk of being shot down or killed. The choice was stark. Either risk temporary visual impairment or face permanent death. The rationale behind why inverted dives could be advantageous lay in principles of energy management and tactical misdirection. When a Zero pilot attempted a tail chase, an attempt to keep the American aircraft in the sights, they typically anticipated that the enemy plane would try to outmaneuver him with a clever turn or climb. These responses, however, resulted in the Japanese craft losing energy, becoming more predictable and easier to target. Conversely, the inverted dive allowed the American pilot to convert altitude into speed in a manner that the Japanese pilot did not expect. This abrupt transformation of position often left the opponent at a disadvantage. Furthermore, if the Japanese pilot tried to follow through with the same maneuver, his aircraft faced significant structural challenges. The Zero aircraft, engineered primarily for positive G loads, up to about 7 Gs, was considerably less capable of handling sustained negative G forces, because its lighter construction was not designed for such stresses. Pulling negative Gs risked structural failure or even engine problems, which could cause catastrophic failure during combat. The structural limitations of the Zero made sustained inverted flight inherently risky. In contrast, the American P-38 Lightning benefits from a robust design, especially regarding its twin Allison engines. These engines used fuel systems that ensured their reliable operation during negative G maneuvers. Unlike many single-engine fighters that relied on carbureted systems, vulnerable to fuel starvation during inverted flight, the P-38's fuel management architecture could sustain power even when viewed from an inverted position. While this wasn't part of Lockheed's original engineering plans for offensive tactics, the practical realities of battle revealed this advantage to be critically important in air combat at the time. For a P-38 pilot, maintaining power and control during inverted dives was an operational advantage in the midst of aerial combat. An inverted dive presented itself as a daring and unconventional battle tactic, offering pilots a potential edge in their engagement with enemy fighters. Some pilots, when executing these maneuvers, occasionally encountered momentary power losses in their aircraft, which could increase their spatial separation from opponents or complicate subsequent maneuvers. Interestingly, the human body's tolerance to negative G forces appeared to surpass what traditional medical literature had anticipated, provided the exposure was brief enough. Those who experienced these forces reported that the visual disturbance known as red out, a phenomenon where blood rushes to the head and eyes, only lasted for a few seconds if the maneuver was conducted properly and with precise timing. During the transition back from negative G to positive G conditions, pilots often experienced a rapid return of vision. The sensations accompanying this change could be intense, often described as a brutal, momentary discomfort that was difficult to ignore. Common symptoms included headaches, facial swelling or fatigue, and bloodshot or bulging eyes, yet most pilots considered these symptoms manageable. Several aviators, during post-mission debriefings, remarked that they would rather suffer a temporary migraine or facial discomfort than face the even graver alternative, a fatal crash into the sea. This informal risk assessment illustrated a clear preference for a technique that, while uncomfortable, could turn the tide of an engagement. Negative G maneuvering was undeniably painful. Indeed, it was less comfortable than the destructive impact of enemy weapons, such as Japanese cannons, which inflicted grievous harm. Major Thomas Lynch, flying a P-38 Lightning out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, is credited as the first pilot documented to have successfully employed the inverted dive intentionally, not merely by accident or under extreme stress. On April the 11th, in the year 1943, Lynch led a squadron patrol over the Huon Gulf, patrolling at around 20,000 feet. During this patrol, they encountered a formation of 80 fighters. Rather than engaging the enemy in a traditional horizontal dogfight, Lynch responded swiftly and decisively. He rolled his aircraft upside down at the approach of a Zero attempting to close in on him, transforming his attack into an inverted position. He then pulled into a steep, high-velocity dive, accelerating his aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Once at a low altitude of approximately 8,000 feet, Lynch leveled out his aircraft, leaving the enemy behind. The Zero pilot who had earlier been pursuing him attempted to follow, executing a climb at 12,000 feet, but was either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed, which had been deliberately maintained. Lynch's actions went beyond mere survival. He turned the tables. After reaching his lower altitude and speed advantage, he used this superior energy to begin a climb away from the disorganized Japanese formation, approaching from below and behind the enemy. The Zeros, now confused and scattered, thought Lynch's aircraft was retreating, and so they pursued. This allowed Lynch to pick off 2 of their fighters during the ensuing combat. His wingmen, following his example and executing similar inverted dives, also survived without loss. The official after-action report acknowledged this innovative tactic but did not give it formal endorsement. At that time, military doctrine generally cautioned against or outright discouraged negative G maneuvers, viewing them as too risky or unconventional for routine use. What made Lynch's employment of the technique particularly noteworthy was his clear intent. He deliberately and repeatedly used the inverted dive, recognizing it as a repeatable and strategic combat tool rather than a momentary accident. Within just a week of this encounter, Lynch began actively teaching this maneuver to other pilots within his squadron, conducting informal briefings during downtime. His instructions were straightforward. If an enemy Zero managed to get behind you and a traditional turn couldn't shake him, simply roll your aircraft inverted, pull through into a high-speed dive, and then use that speed and altitude to break away. The core principle was to avoid trying to outmaneuver the Zero in the horizontal plane, where they primarily had the advantage, and instead exploit the vertical dimension. The Zero fighter owned the agility in horizontal circles, but American fighters like the P-38 excelled at diving vertically and setting the pace. By the middle of the year 1943, the tactic had begun spreading beyond Lynch's squadron. It found its way into other units operating from Oxford-handed Guadalcanal and around the Russell Islands, where American pilots exchanged these techniques during readiness discussions and after-action reviews. Despite this organic proliferation, the inverted dive remained unofficial. It was neither forbidden nor officially approved but was considered more of an accepted wartime innovation, an under-the-radar tactic the pilots relied upon when conventional methods failed. Over time, this maneuver evolved into a symbol of ingenuity and adaptability in aerial combat, illustrating how creativity and tactical experimentation could challenge formal doctrine and change the course of engagements in the Second World War's skies. The inevitable prelude to a life-changing moment, blindly flying back into the fray. Leaders recognized the undeniable effectiveness of this tactic, yet they hesitated to formalize it in written regulations or official training protocols. The primary concern stemmed from legal vulnerabilities. If a pilot attempting the maneuver were to be killed or injured, questions would immediately arise about who had authorized such a risky, unapproved tactic. especially since it directly contradicted standard training procedures established by the broader military hierarchy. As a result, rather than being officially sanctioned, the technique spread informally among pilots, passed from experienced aviators to newcomers through word of mouth and personal demonstrations. Veteran pilots would show less experienced ones how to execute the move, demonstrating the key steps and nuances silently, without any written instructions or formal briefings that could later be scrutinized or used against higher command. When the 475th Fighter Group arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August of 1943, they received only informal briefings from seasoned veterans of the 49th Fighter Group, who shared their knowledge and experience about this inverted dive tactic. Over time, one of the most notable early practitioners was Major Charles MacDonald, who would go on to become one of the most successful aces in the Pacific theater, accumulating a total of 27 air-to-air kills. MacDonald later credited the Split S, a maneuver involving a half-loop or inverted dive, with saving his life on at least 3 separate occasions, underscoring its critical importance and effectiveness. His combat reports from late into 1943 reveal a rather pragmatic combat style, engaging enemy Zero fighters by dropping from altitude, making high-speed passes by the enemy, and if under attack while climbing back up, rolling inverted and diving away to escape, then re-engaging the enemy on more favorable terms. This tactic wasn't the refined, elegant dogfighting maneuver often depicted in textbooks. Rather, it was a calculated application of what could be called industrial-strength survival mathematics. In essence, it was about pushing physical and mental limits to stay alive long enough to fight another day, often at the cost of the pilot's immediate well-being. One of the most daunting aspects was the physiological toll inflicted by negative G-forces during the Split S. In these brief but intense moments, the pilot's blood pressure in the head surged dramatically as blood vessels in the eyes and face engorged with blood due to the reversed acceleration, leading to a sensation of immense pressure behind the eyes followed by a startling visual phenomenon: the entire visual field turning crimson, a condition sometimes described as red out. During these critical 2 or 3 seconds, the pilot was effectively flying blind. Guided solely by kinesthetic feel and mental memory of key instrument readings, they had no view of the target, enemy aircraft, or ground. The physical aftermath of executing such maneuvers was starkly documented by Captain James Moorhead, an aviation flight surgeon stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal during late 1943. His examinations of numerous pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics revealed that nearly all suffered from petechial hemorrhages, tiny, pinpoint bleedings under the skin that appeared as red spots across the face, especially around the eyes and forehead. Some pilots experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages, more intense bleeding that left their eyes bloodshot and crimson for days after the maneuver. Universal among these pilots were severe headaches, repercussions of the intense vascular pressure created during the negative G strain. A few even reported temporary visual disturbances, blurring or difficulty focusing, that persisted for several hours post-mission. Moorhead's clinical interpretation, though never formally published in medical journals, was that such maneuvers inflicted measurable physical trauma, damage that was unlikely to cause permanent harm but nonetheless significant enough to warrant concern. The greatest danger bestowed by the maneuver was encountered during those critical moments of temporary blindness. In the brief span when a pilot's vision was obscured by the crimson field, vital instruments, such as the altimeter, airspeed indicator, and the aircraft's attitude indicator, became inaccessible. Not only that, but the pilot couldn't see the enemy or the rapidly approaching ground below. Such a maneuver demanded unwavering commitment. One needed to precisely set the initial dive angle, pull the negative Gs smoothly and forcefully, then sustain that control input until the vision returned. Trust in one's judgment was absolutely essential as they navigated this narrow window of obscured sight, all the while knowing that any mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences, either crashing or being preyed upon by the enemy while blindly flying through space. Despite the risks, pilots learned the importance of balancing faith in their instincts, precise control, and a readiness to accept the peril inherent in such a bold and physically demanding tactic. The act of performing a rolling inverted maneuver proved to be fraught with peril, especially during training exercises where pilots learned firsthand just how deadly a poorly executed stunt could be. Many catastrophic accidents occurred when aviators initiated the roll too close to the ground or held their dives for too prolonged a period, resulting in loss of control and often tragic fatalities. At altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Mistakes at such low levels left no room for correction or recovery. In contrast, when pilots operated at 15,000 feet or higher, they had sufficient time to recognize and rectify their mistakes, making the mathematical understanding of the maneuver an essential part of their survival toolkit. Guidance strictly advised against going inverted below 8,000 feet unless death seemed an inevitable outcome of not doing so. With experience came the development of various techniques designed to shorten the duration of the redoubt upon entering the inverted position, as this interval posed the greatest risk. Some pilots mastered tensing their neck and facial muscles intensely, attempting to constrict blood flow to their brains as a way to delay blackout, a dangerous but sometimes necessary tactic. Others found that if they entered the inverted posture with a less aggressive pull on the control stick, trading the utmost maneuverability for improved visual awareness, they could retain some degree of sight throughout the inversion, aiding their judgment during critical moments. Pilots faced a key trade-off. Forcing the maximum negative G forces would achieve quicker separation from an adversary, such as a pursuing enemy aircraft or missile, but at the grave cost of complete visual blackouts, which could be fatal if they were unable to see an imminent threat or escape route. Conversely, a moderate level of negative G effort allowed for some visual references to be maintained but rendered the escape less effective, potentially compromising the pilot's ability to evade danger. In real life, most aviators leaned toward incurring the maximum separation as their top priority. Being temporarily blind for 3 seconds was a small price to pay compared to the certainty of being shot down if caught semi-conscious or unable to respond. The psychological challenges associated with this maneuver were equally as daunting as the physical ones. Human beings possess deep-seated evolutionary instincts that protect against pain and sensory deprivation, instinctively warning against actions that threaten personal safety or induce extreme disorientation. Willingly causing oneself to go temporarily blind while an enemy was actively trying to kill them, an act that seemed to run counter to survival logic, was truly an extraordinary challenge for any pilot. Nevertheless, with repeated exposure, pilots learn to override and suppress these innate fears. The initial attempts, often their first times, were terrifying and harrowing, inducing sheer panic and dread. However, subsequent experiences gradually became less intimidating. The second or third attempt still held elements of fear but was less overwhelming. By the time pilots reached their 5th or 6th attempt, the inverted dive practice became almost routine, a grim part of combat flying, comparable in its psychological toll to dealing with anti-aircraft fire, managing dwindling fuel supplies, or witnessing their comrades fall in battle. Their bodies and minds adapted, developing a form of resilience that transformed what once seemed impossible into a standard, if dangerous, aspect of aerial combat. The act, once shrouded in fear and hesitation, became another day's work, just like synchronized bombing runs or formation flying, cloaked in the familiarity that came with repetition. Within the vast chaos of the Pacific theater, the inverted dive tactic circulated covertly among the fighter units, almost like an underground communication, spreading from squadron to squadron with no official documentation in tactical manuals, perhaps driven by necessity, secrecy, and the unspoken understanding among seasoned pilots. By September of the year 1943, units flying the P-38 Lightning across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands had begun actively teaching this maneuver to new replacements within their first week of arrival, often in informal settings following the day's missions. The training itself was carried out unofficially, experienced pilots pulling aside fresh-faced aces newcomers in the evenings, recounting lessons learned from their own perilous encounters and sharing techniques that could mean the difference between life and death. Squadron commanders, fully aware that such reckless training was unfolding, often chose a delicate stance of either approving, encouraging, or deliberately ignoring these lessons, maintaining a fragile deniability should higher command, such as the 5th Air Force Headquarters, inquire about unauthorized or rogue training practices. One notable example was Colonel Neil Kirby of the 348th Fighter Group, which operated the formidable P-47 Thunderbolt out of Port Moresby. Recognizing the value of the split S technique, a half-loop followed by a roll, Kirby incorporated it into his squadron's tactical repertoire as early as October of 1943. Although the P-47 was significantly heavier than the P-38 and exhibited poor turning agility in dogfights against Japanese Zeros, it was an aircraft designed for speed and diving. Its robust radial engine handled aggressive dives and negative G conditions reasonably well. Kirby's pragmatic approach leaned into the aircraft's strengths, emphasizing speed and rapid descent in the complex and perilous skies of the Pacific theater during World War II. Aviators constantly refined their tactics to gain the upper hand against formidable adversaries like the Mitsubishi Zero. An insightful commander, a seasoned pilot and tactician, knew that the Zero's greatest vulnerability lay in its limited capabilities for sustained high-speed inverted flight and its weaker structural integrity under such stress. Recognizing this, he explicitly instructed his pilots that trying to execute basic turns while maintaining flight at a zero altitude could be fatal. Instead, he emphasized that leveraging the P-47 Thunderbolt's robust weight and impressive power output would be key to prevailing in combat scenarios, particularly during vertical engagements. He advised his pilots to perform dive attacks, quick, steep dives aimed at placing the enemy advantage asleep, and, when necessary, rapidly inverted their aircraft to escape any pursuit. These inverted escapes proved unexpectedly effective, especially because the successful pullout from a dive at high speed could be achieved with confidence, given the aircraft's resilience. On October the 11th, in the year of 1943, this tactical doctrine enabled Kirby personally to shoot down a remarkable total of 6 Japanese aircraft, a feat earned through precise application of these aerial maneuvers. Recognizing the significance of this achievement, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the country's highest military decoration, for that particular mission. This successful approach did not remain confined to one squadron but quickly found its way into the broader tactical doctrine of the Marine Corps fighter units. By early 1944, squadrons flying the F-4U Corsair adopted similar techniques, leveraging the aircraft's performance advantages over the Zero in nearly every parameter except turning radius. Marine aviators operating from remote island bases such as Munda and Villa Lavella discovered that inverted dives were not simply a backup maneuver but became a reliable strategy for escaping dangerous situations. The Corsair's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine maintained adequate thrust even during negative G maneuvers, which meant the aircraft could execute inverted dives more confidently and for longer durations. Its sturdy construction was another crucial advantage. It enabled pilots to pull out of dives at higher speeds without risking structural failure, a common concern with more delicate aircraft. Major Robert Gaylor, an esteemed instructor leading tactics development for the Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the famed Black Sheep Squadron, regularly demonstrated this maneuver for his pilots. His teachings reinforced that this inverted dive method was primarily a defensive tool, designed to help pilots escape, not to be used offensively. By mid-1944, the technique had gained acceptance within Navy carrier squadrons working in the Central Pacific. Carrier-based fighter pilots aboard ships like the USS Essex and USS Lexington were briefed extensively on this emerging tactic, and it gradually became a customary part of their defensive repertoire. The official terminology varied from ship to ship. Some pilots called it a split S, while others referred to it as a negative G maneuver, or simply described it as rolling out downward. Despite these linguistic differences, the essence of the move remained consistent across the fleet. The procedure dictated that, when traditional defensive maneuvers such as tight turns or damage control was insufficient, the pilot would invert the aircraft and plunge downward quickly. A move with a safety threshold typically set around 8,000 feet above sea level. If threat levels persisted below this altitude, pilots were advised to activate other escape options or accept that combat was inevitable, often acknowledging that they were in a fight to the death. Not every aircraft was equally suited to perform such daring maneuvers. The F-6F Hellcat, for example, with its carbureted engine, occasionally experienced coughing or temporary engine failures during prolonged inverted flight, although engine restart was generally manageable. Army Air Force P-40 Warhawks, while structurally capable of withstanding inverted dives, often fell short in terms of dive performance, limiting their ability to create sufficient separation from pursuing Zero fighters. These inherent aircraft limitations meant that the strategy was tailored to specific types. For instance, P-38 Lightnings, renowned for their strong structural design and high-altitude performance, could make inverted dives a primary defense mechanism. Conversely, the P-40 needed to rely on other tactics more suited to its capabilities. Still, the fundamental principle held firm across the entire theater. Vertical maneuvers, especially inverted dives, could beat traditional horizontal turning fights in many circumstances. Strategic thinkers recognized early on that, when properly executed, a high-speed, steep inverted dive was a formidable tactic for evading enemy fire. Soon, Japanese pilots became aware of this American tactic and tried to develop countermeasures. By late 1943, intelligence reports and combat debriefings from returning Zero pilots increasingly mentioned American fighters executing high-speed rolls into inverted positions and diving away swiftly. At first, Japanese assessments interpreted these maneuvers as purely defensive, viewing them as signs that American pilots preferred fleeing when faced with close-quarters combat rather than fighting directly. This perception reinforced the stereotype that U.S. fighters were risk-averse, avoiding direct engagement whenever possible and fleeing at the first sign of trouble. The strategic misjudgment inherent in the Japanese approach to aerial combat during this period proved immensely risky, as it reinforced their already narrow tactical doctrine without addressing the evolving nature of the threat they faced. Their reliance on the classic inverted dive maneuver, which was once effective in certain engagement scenarios, was now more a marker of their outdated thinking than a viable combat tactic. To the Japanese, An inverted dive was seen not as a retreat, but as a method of resetting their position, giving them a brief window to re-engage from a more advantageous angle and speed. This approach assumed that American pilots would continue to follow an attack in predictable ways, but history showed that such assumptions often proved fatally flawed. In practice, many Japanese pilots attempted to pursue American fighters through these inverted dives, hoping to catch them off guard or to regain the initiative. However, the results of such audacious maneuvers frequently ended in disaster. The Zero, with its lightweight construction and exceptional agility in horizontal turns, became a liability when attempting high-speed, vertical maneuvers like inverted dives. The aircraft's airframe was subjected to incredible stress, often pushing it close to the G-force limits designed for positive G maneuvers, yet it remained far more vulnerable under negative G conditions, where safety margins shrank dangerously. Numerous Zero pilots who tried to emulate such daring tactics of following agile American fighters into inverted dives found themselves in serious trouble. Many experienced control surface flutter, an oscillation that can rapidly lead to structural failure, particularly when approaching speeds over 380 miles per hour. Others faced more insidious issues, such as fuel delivery problems within their Nakajima Sakai engines during inverted flight, which caused sudden power loss at the worst possible moment, especially when they were attempting to maintain their attack lane or track a target from above. These mechanical failures, combined with the aircraft's structural limitations, often proved to be deadly. One well-documented incident from December of 1944, over Leyte Gulf, exemplified the peril and unpredictability of these tactics when Zero pilots confronted American fighters using similar maneuvers. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, found himself ambushed by 4 Zero fighters circling at about 18,000 feet. As the lead Zero lined up a firing solution, McGuire responded instinctively by rolling his P-38 inverted and plunging downward to gain speed and a better position. The Japanese pilot was quick to follow, attempting to keep McGuire within his gun sight. In that split second, two critical things happened. McGuire's aircraft accelerated past 450 miles per hour in the dive, yet maintained structural integrity, while nearly simultaneously, the pursuing Zero began to shudder violently around the 380 miles per hour mark. This severe vibration indicated that the Zero was near its structural limits, forcing the Japanese pilot to break off the pursuit prematurely. If he had continued, the risk of catastrophic structural failure was high. McGuire, leveraging the kinetic energy he gained during the dive, leveled out at around 6,000 feet. Re-energized and with a superior energy state relative to his opponents, he quickly returned to the fight and shot down 2 of the remaining Zeros, while the other 2 chose to disengage rather than risk their aircraft. This incident underscored a much larger issue facing Japanese pilots during that stage of the war. By late 1944, the Zero was increasingly ill-suited for the kinds of combat that had become typical. Early in the conflict, when dogfights often occurred at mid-altitudes with prolonged turning battles, the Zero's excellent maneuverability and lightweight made it a formidable aerial opponent. However, as American tactics evolved, favoring fast, high-energy pursuit, vertical climbing, and hit-and-run attacks, the Zero's primary advantages became obsolete. Its fundamental weaknesses, lack of armor, a lightweight and structurally limited airframe, and a maximum dive speed that was insufficient against newer American fighters, turned into critical vulnerabilities in these modern combat scenarios. Recognizing these deficiencies, Japanese aircraft designers endeavored to improve upon the original Zero platform. The later variants of the Zero, along with newer fighters like the J-2M Ryuden, featured enhanced dive performance, stronger airframes, and better structural integrity. Unfortunately, these upgraded aircraft were produced in limited numbers and arrived too late to significantly alter the trajectory of the air war. The changing realities of combat had already shifted beyond their capabilities. Moreover, Japan's training programs found themselves unable to adapt quickly enough to these new realities. By 1944, the rapidly deteriorating war situation meant that experienced pilots were being lost at an alarming rate, faster than new pilots could be trained to replace them. When new recruits finally arrived at flying schools, they received only abbreviated training that concentrated on basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics rooted in earlier combat paradigms. There was no sufficient time or resources to teach advanced energy management techniques or vertical maneuvering methods critical for confronting modern American fighters in high-speed environments. Meanwhile, American training sequences had incorporated by the end of World War II, veteran fighter pilots and the fresh crop of combatants arriving in the Pacific theater were operating with a markedly different understanding of aerial combat maneuvers. The newer pilots, who reached the front lines in late 1944, had the advantage of pre-existing knowledge about inverted dive tactics, a stark contrast to the earlier war years. Prior to this, Japanese pilots, who had dominated the skies early in the conflict due to their extensive experience and tactical expertise, found themselves increasingly unprepared for the ever-evolving realities of aerial combat. As the war progressed, inverted dive tactics, originally developed and refined by Allied pilots in the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, became a staple part of fighter combat doctrine. Although often applied seamlessly in the chaos of dogfights, these tactics were sometimes used without explicit acknowledgement of the innovative efforts by pilots flying aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and the F-4U Corsair, who were striving to survive against formidable enemies. Over subsequent decades, the principles of negative G maneuvers, such as aggressive pitchovers and inverted rolls, became entrenched in modern fighter tactics training. This knowledge is now standard fare in elite institutions like the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, more popularly known as Top Gun. Pilot trainees are thoroughly taught the importance of negative G maneuvers as essential defensive actions, a practice rooted in wartime ingenuity but honed through years of tactical development. The terminology used to describe these maneuvers has also evolved. Today's fighter pilots speak of executing a negative G pushover or performing an unloaded roll, yet the underlying physics remain unchanged. The fundamental goal persists: to create unexpected escape routes by exploiting gravitational forces in ways that opponents often fail to anticipate. This concept, originally elucidated by Thomas Lynch during tense battles around New Guinea in April of 1943, continues to underpin air combat strategies. During the Korean War, the effectiveness of these tactics persisted. American pilots, facing the high-performance Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters, employed similar inverted and negative G escape maneuvers to counteract the MiG's advantages at high altitudes. The MiG's superior horizontal agility and excellent high-altitude performance challenged American aircraft, particularly the F-86 Sabre. Facing such capabilities, North American pilots often resorted to vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes, precisely the same tactics used by their predecessors fighting Zeros in the Pacific, aimed at positioning themselves advantageously or shedding a pursuing enemy. One of the war's top aces, Captain Joseph McConnell, credited his remarkable survival in numerous dogfights to a maneuver he described as rolling out underneath, attacking MiGs. an application of the inverted dive concept at a jet's operational altitude of around 40,000 feet and speeds spanning 600 miles per hour. These familiar yet reinvented maneuvers proved their continued relevance in jet combat, preserving core tactical wisdom from earlier eras. The lessons learned from these conflicts proved crucial during the Vietnam War. American fighter pilots, initially trained and oriented towards using heat-seeking and beyond visual range missiles, found themselves thrust into close-range dogfights against agile MiG-17 and MiG-21 aircraft. Early encounters were marked by disappointing results, highlighting the importance of traditional dogfighting skills that, during that time, seemed to be a lost art amid the push for technological warfare. In response, the United States established the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School at Miramar, California, in 1969, an institutional acknowledgement that core aerial combat skills, including negative-G defensive maneuvers, remained vital despite technological advances in missile and radar systems. The focus was on ingraining tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized intuitively. Fly with your aircraft's inherent strengths, avoid exposing weaknesses to the enemy, and when under attack, go vertical, sometimes even inverted, to shake off opponents or gain a positional advantage. The design of modern fighter aircraft has incorporated these principles into their physical capabilities. Jets like the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the F/A-18 Hornet, and the F-35 Lightning II are equipped with fuel systems, engine configurations, and structural reinforcements engineered to support sustained negative-G flight, choices made specifically to overcome limitations faced by 19th and 20th century counterparts. Pilot training has also advanced. They undergo centrifuge training that prepares them to tolerate both positive and negative G forces safely. In earlier conflicts, the rapid loss of consciousness and hemorrhaging from the eyes, known as the readout, was a terrifying threat. Today, such effects are well understood and manageable. Nevertheless, the fundamental principle underlying these maneuvers remains unchanged. Negative-G flight continues to serve as a crucial tactical tool, enabling pilots to execute unpredictable, disruptive moves that opponents do not expect, creating the vital space for successful counterattacks or escape. This timeless concept underscores how the blend of fundamental physics, pilot ingenuity, and technological capability persists as the foundation of aerial combat across generations. What truly renders the innovative strategies during the Pacific War so extraordinary is that they emerged entirely outside the formal channels of military development or official doctrine. These tactics were not conceived by aeronautical engineers brainstorming in laboratory settings, nor were they debated and sanctioned by tactical innovation panels tasked with devising new combat procedures. Instead, they took shape organically within the tight-knit community of combat pilots, often long after their effectiveness had already been demonstrated through fierce, unrelenting engagements in the heat of battle. In the chaos and stress of aerial combat, knowledge was transmitted informally, handed down from veteran pilots to rookies through direct mentorship, often person to person, squadron to squadron. This guerrilla-like evolution of combat tactics meant that the people responsible for groundbreaking maneuvers almost never received official recognition. Most of them were simply members of fighter units, unaware that their improvisations would influence fighter combat doctrine for more than 8 decades to come. Their work was driven by necessity, ingenuity, and the instinct to survive, rather than by official planning or academic research. One notable figure, Richard Bong, who held the record as America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, survived the war in part because he mastered the art of vertical combat, a technique that involved flying inverted and using the airplane's momentum to achieve the upper hand over opponents. Bong was unafraid to push the limits of inverted flight when situations demanded it, a skill that often meant the difference between life and death. In contrast, another pioneer, Thomas Lynch, who was one of the first to intentionally employ the inverted tactics during combat, was tragically killed in action over the Philippines in March of 1944. His death was not a sign of the tactics' failure. Rather, it underscored the brutal reality of aerial combat, which remains statistically lethal, regardless of a pilot's skill level. What binds these pilots' legacies isn't medals or official accolades, but the enduring knowledge that their daring improvisations contributed to the very fabric of fighter combat training. Today's fighter pilots still learn to perform inverted rolls and to push their aircraft into negative G maneuvers during defensive maneuvers, standing on the shoulders of these early pioneers who risked everything to redefine aerial combat, sometimes rewriting the rules right in the middle of a dogfight, out of sheer necessity to survive. Their pioneering improvisations during the Pacific War thus remain a testament to the power of brave, real-time innovation born in the cockpit, driven not by bureaucracy but by the primal urge to stay alive when the odds are stacked against you.